Hi from Dave. Today I'm gonna talk about progression. Progression, it's something that is really rumored nowadays. Is the word, the term that I heard the most. In the trails, in the forums, everywhere, everyone is talking about progression. Clearly we are talking about rear end of the bike because there's a linkage, there's a shock. All the questions like what is progression, how much is the right progression, air or coil shocks are progressive or linear, all these queries are going to be answered in this video. Because I've heard phone calls, emails, I had so much people ask me about these things, and I really think no one understood how it really works. Everyone loves the suspensions which is really soft at the beginning and then really hard at the end. Everyone thinks this is the sweet suspension, which is actually crap, right? And everyone thinks that a linear suspensions is actually Satan. Well, to me, it's the opposite. So we have to start zeroing and change all our ideas about this topic and listen to what I'm going to say in this video. I will bring nice example in the video, at the end of the video actually. For instance, GT Fury 2014, extremely linear bike from the beginning to the end of the stroke, which was really nice, and it won a lot of World Cups too. So let's go back to main topic. What is the progression? Clearly we start from Wikipedia. What is the progression? Mathematical stuff. A succession of quantities in which there is a constant relation between each member and the one succeeding it. What this means? It means that you have a numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 is actually a progression. And what's the constant number between these numbers? It's 1. 1 plus 1, 2, 2 plus 1, 3, 3 plus 1, 4, and so on. If I want to draw this type of progression, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I can draw a line between these numbers, and it's a straight line. It's a straight line, but actually is a progression. It's a progression with a constant growing numbers. Everyone calls this thing Satan and everyone calls this linear. It's actually a progression, an arithmetic progression. And it works pretty well. For the growing of the centimeters in the stroke, we have a growing of force required. But what's the difference between this sort of progression and the everyone progression idea? In this one, it's the arithmetic progression, and it's a sequence in which term is obtained by the addition of a constant number to the preceding term. It's constant, it grows in a constant way. Now we see and we analyze what is actually the second type of progression, which is actually the one that everyone thinks about, and it's the geometric progression. A progression where the sequence of terms in which the ratio between any two successive terms is the same as the progression. 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. If I draw the line, it comes out a curved line. It's not anymore constant, it grows in an exponential way. So it's a progression with an exponential growing. And these are the two, the arithmetic progression with a constant growing and the geometric progression with an exponential growing. These are the two. Which one is the best? I could even take the type A, the arithmetic progression constant, and shift it all the way up by adding a stiffer spring in the coil shock. So this is gonna be the line. And everyone would say, no, I want the curved one because it's really soft at the beginning and then harsh at the end. No, I actually prefer a stiffer spring with a linear rate that gives you a really solid mid-range where we stay 80% of our riding time. So Which one is the best? Well, we talk about again in the later part of the video. I just want to focus about the big mistake about calling an arithmetic progression like a linear thing and a geometric progression like progressive. We always have two progressive things. Now we go back to suspension type. Today I'm gonna talk about air and coil shocks. I want to see which one is more progressive or which one is linear, if there's one. And I want to match these two type of shocks to different type of leverages and linkages on the bikes. Let's say starting like anyone wants a soft suspension at the beginning and a hard suspension at the end. Everyone reduce air and add tokens and things like this. Actually, nothing works, trust me. This one is a soft suspension with a hard end. A suspension in this type, well, of this type, is actually like a pillow, which is put in between ourselves and the obstacle. This is the obstacle, this is my suspensions. When I hit it, the suspension moves pretty freely because it's a soft suspension at the beginning. And so my hand is compressing the suspension. As soon as I start touching the suspension starts moving. But there is no actually substantial force that counteract my press. And so it's really soft at the beginning, yeah, of course, but at some point deep in the stroke, it will become really hard and really harsh, and then I will touch the bottom of the stroke. This is not a progression. This is actually crap to me. And if I want to draw this type of suspensions, like if I want to make a graph, it will come up a line. This type, really soft, really soft, really soft, and at some point growing extremely to the bottom out. This isn't a progression, it's a geometric progression with a really high exponential sequence. I don't actually like this type of suspension, it will never work. We will always feel harsh hits with this type. Now we talk about second type of suspension. It's a really stiffer suspension, as we can see, and if I do the same movement as before, I can't even go to bottom out this suspension. This one counteracts to my press in a solid and positive way from the beginning of the suspension's movement, well, suspension travel, we can say. And if I draw the line of the suspension B, this is gonna be the line. We will have a lot of more support preventing the diving in the mid-range, and we will end up just about at the same point at the bottom out. So, to the tests I have been doing through the years, the soft and hard suspensions is actually not working. What we need is a constant growing suspensions force. That's a good progression. It's a constant growing progression, not a really soft and then hard progression with a sharp turn, you know, a sharp design. So we go back to the beginning of the video. Two progression types, arithmetic and geometric progression. Now we have seen which are the two types of progression. Now I want to show you which are the two types of progression that comes out from the two different shocks. I have been preparing a graph with two lines that comes out from two shocks I have been testing in my nice machines I have here. One, of course, is the air shock, the other one is a coil shock. From 0 to 100 of the stroke, it was a 216 by 63 millimeter shock, and the big difference, it's clearly shown here, is the way they are progressive actually. The blue one is the coil, of course, really constant arithmetic growing progression, really constant. progression. It's the blue one, of course. We can see at the end a little change in the line. That's the bottom out bumper, which adds a little bit more of progression just at the end of the stroke, like I'm drawing here. Red one is a typical modern air shock. The old ones were pretty worst, but let's talk about the modern ones like this one. So really stiff at the beginning to move, then there's a regression, so a change in the curve in the central part, and then another change of the curve towards the progressive way, geometrical progressive way, from the half or second third to the end. So these are coil and air shock. And the first error I hear every day is that coil shocks are not progressive and air shocks are progressive. This is wrong, wrong and wrong. Between these two, the more progressive one is the blue one, which is the coil shock. It has a soft beginning of the stroke, a super solid mid-range and a really good end progression. But if we look at the air shock, which is usually known as progressive, it's actually the opposite, because we have a really soft, a really hard beginning, and then we have a dive in mid-range. Where is the progression in this shock? There is none. But don't forget that we can shift all the shape of the line in the air shock. We can shift it up by adding a lot of air inside. Then you can say, yeah, there's a lot of progression in this air shock. But don't forget, you're gonna lose the sag point. And as you can see, I have been drawing and making the test exactly, placing the two shocks with the same pressure or coil spring type to have the same sag point value, because I want to have the same sag value, and from there I can read which one gives me more progression. Clearly, if I throw in 500 psi in an air shock, it's gonna be more progressive than a coil shock, but I'm gonna have no sag. So, as you can see, starting from the same sag point, the more progressive shock is the coil shock. It's not the air like everyone says. For this case, I thrown a lot of tokens inside the shock, and it was really progressive. If I put less tokens inside, the line would have been even more regressive in the mid-range like I'm drawing now. So, another point to the coil shock. Air shocks can't be progressive like coils, and the mid-range will never be present and solid like coil shocks. If you leave the tokens out from an air shock, you probably have to throw a lot of air in to have a mid-range, but if you throw a lot of air in, you will lose the sag point. Now I wanna apply the progressive concept to the linkages and the leverages, and here starts the big topic of this video. What is a progressive frame? What is a linear frame? We have to talk about our bro from Syracuse, the Archimede. He was a great man, he was a great bro. He says, give me a leverage, I lift up the world. He wasn't so stupid actually, yeah, he was a genius. He said that I can lift a big stone, give him a pole, and I use the leverage. Yeah, he's the man. What is the linkage or leverage? It's a machine that doesn't create energy, it just convert and multiply energy through a mechanical tweak and trick. It's important that the leverage and the linkage comes from this guy, because we are gonna talk about leverages and linkages in the mountain bike world. This is another example. You can see I can shift up a load by using the leverage. Don't forget, in the mountain bike we can have the shock installed vertically, horizontally, anyway, with a lot of linkages and rockers, but we will always have a linkage and a leverage in our mountain bikes. For practical explanations, we can say we have 150 millimeters of travel at the wheel axle. We only have 50 millimeters at the shock stroke shaft. So we have a leverage ratio, a 3:1. 3 centimeters of movement at the wheel axle will move 1 centimeter at the shock stroke shaft. We have to take in account, we have to think that this leverage, 3:1, always changes through the travel. This means if we start at the beginning of the stroke with the wheel extended with 3:1 leverage, we may end up, when at bottom out, at 2:1. That means the last 5 centimeters at the wheel, we will move only 25 millimeters of shaft at the shock. So as we can see, there's a difference and change in the leverage ratio. End of the stroke, beginning of the stroke and end of the stroke.
Vediamo un grafico, per esempio, ho parlato prima della GT Fury.
Let's analyze some of the frames to better understand what I'm trying to say. GT Fury 2014, a really sweet bike, I've been using it and that's really nice. It's a blue line here. As we can see, we can start and analyze the leverage ratio of the Fury, and at the zero travel, so at beginning of the stroke, we had a 3:1 leverage ratio. Moving through the depth of the travel, which was 220 millimeters, we had 2.8:1 leverage ratio number. These were the numbers, or are the numbers, which identified the leverage ratio difference between the beginning of the stroke and the end of the stroke on the GT Fury. Now I grab a calculator and I divide 3 by 2.8, and the number that comes out, it's 3 divided 2.8 equals 1.07. This is the magic number. This means 7% of progression.
7% di progressione. Cioè sostanzialmente questa bici, avendo questi valori, ha una progressione del 7%, cioè purtroppo in maniera molto.
This is one of the way used in the mountain bike world to talk about a progression in the leverage. And if I want to draw the line, the graph of how much this progression was using a coil shock, we could draw a graph this way: 220 millimeters of travel, kilograms on the y-axle. Let's say if the bike was 0% progressive with a coil shock, it would have this line, actually a straight line. As said, it's a progressive arithmetical constant progression. But because I installed this shock, a linear shock, inside in a progressive frame with a 7% figure, we will have a line that grows up a little bit towards the end by a 7% figure. This value here, as said, should be 7%. Now let's grab another frame for making another example. Let's grab another bike which everyone loves, well, at least here in Italy. Specialized Turbo Levo 2019-20, whatever, the latest model. How much progression is there in the Levo? Is it linear? Is it progressive? Right. Starting at the stroke, 3.15 leverage ratio at the beginning of the stroke. End stroke, about 2.63. These numbers are taken from a graph. I may make mistakes reading the numbers, but not that much. Let's calculate 3.15 divided by 263. Let's round this up. I get 20%. So the Levo is progressive at 20%. Let's look the Fury and the Fury. What's the difference between these two bikes? Fury was 7%, Levo is 20%, so to me it's like 3 times more progressive than the Fury. What means if the Fury is progressive 20%? I already know everyone is going to ask me, can I install coil shocks on the Levo? Well, the answer is pretty easy. If I have a coil shocks which it's linear and then I add 20% more of linkage progression, what happened? Nothing, no problem. I will have a nice curve with a 20% more strong end of the stroke. Let's see another bike. Let's grab the LAPIERRE GLP 2019-20 latest model. What we have here? Beginning of the stroke, blue line, about 3.06 leverage ratio. End of the stroke, about 2.47-ish. Let's grab the calculator again. 3.06 divide 2.47, 24%.
Ci metto il monomolla, avrò tutta la linearità, la progressione aritmetica costante della molla più un extra 24 andando su verso il fondo corsa.
Let's grab the usual bike with 20% of progression at the linkage, and let's say we want to install an air shock. What happened here? Let's draw the typical line from a coil shock, which is an arithmetic progression constant with the 20% increase given by the linkage. This is gonna be the line. Now we draw the line that comes out from the air shock. We will have a stiffer beginning, really more like harsh mid-stroke, and then it will ramp up at the same at the end. So between the two, to me, it's always bad. Coils are better. So we still have some linear frames. What are linear frames? A linear frame is a frame that starts from 315 and ends at 315. I think there is none. At least a little bit of progression, it's there. There's also difference, a variance in the coil shock, and it's the progressive spring. What is the progressive spring? Actually, every coil is a progressive spring, but the so-called progressive springs are springs that change the ratio at some point during the travel. What happened if I install a progressive spring? Match. Well, this is the classical coil spring and this is the progressive spring. There is a point where the progressive spring changes shape. Well, clearly, This is the L, linear spring, and this is the P, progressive spring. I don't really like this sort of a variance in the drawing, because I will have a sort of a dive in mid-range. I don't really like it, you know, soft suspensions that comes really hard at the end. I don't like that stuff. I prefer a good support and a solid mid-range, so I would normally grab a normal spring with a 50 pounds more, and then I will have a solid mid-range having the same bottom out force. Don't forget, we always have also the bottom out bumper, which is progressive too. I made some calculations and tests, and the progressive spring is usually 17% progressive. This means there is a 17% end value between the linear and the progressive spring. So, let's say I have a 20% progressive linkage bike, and then I throw on a 17% progressive spring. What end? I end up having a 37 progressive combo, and to me, we will fall in between a soft and a harsh suspension at the end. The first type, the one that I don't like. Clearly, if I have a bike which is only 2% progressive, 3% progressive, so pretty linear, and then I throw in a progressive spring of 17%, then I will have a 19, 20, 21% figure, which I really like. There is actually no perfect number that I could advise to anyone. Clearly, I was really happy with bikes like Fury, 7% of progression, linear, Coil, and I was really happy with it. Now, probably bikes with less travel, like 140mm 50, we may need a little bit more of progression, but it's all a technical thing. We have to study these things each bike. But definitely, I think that the bike that has 40, 50% of progression with an extra 17 coming from a progressive spring, then it's not really good. So everyone would say, so the coil shock could be installed on any bike, Dave? Yes, this is what I mean. Coils are perfect for any bike. Adjust your compression and rebound, and coils are always good. There's one more last thing to understand about leverages and linkages. Let's grab a shock. A shock is not only composed by a coil. A shock is composed by coil and hydraulic circuits. What is a hydraulic? The hydraulic circuits are brakes that oppose to compressions and rebounds. And let's say that we set up the hydraulic to work with a 3-to-1 leverage ratio. I will have a sort of a resistance, but then if this leverage changes, moving through the travel, the hydraulic will react in a different way. Let's say we start and we set up a nice bike with a 3-to-1 leverage hydraulic shim stack, and then the leverage changes at the end of the stroke going a 2-to-1 leverage. What will happen to the hydraulic? It will happen that the shock will want to be able to move, or it will be actually harder and harsher, more stiff, because an hydraulic shim stack laid down for a 3-to-1 leverage, it will always stiffen up when worked and used in a 2-to-1 leverage ratio. This means that if you go bottom out and then you want some traction when you are a bottom out in a really high leverage ratio bike, you won't have the traction because the hydraulic will be always too stiff if it's set up for the beginning of the stroke. So what I mean here is that a leverage ratio with high changes in the numbers will always interfere with the hydraulic circuits in the shock. I really prefer a constant leverage and then if I want some progression I will throw in a progressive spring. But all these ideas are specified, bike specified and rider specified topics, so I could never say these things are, belongs to anyone. If my bike comes out from the factory with 3% progression, I probably have a lot of movement for doing the tunings. If my bike starts with a 50 or 60%, then I won't probably have a lot of, room for make the tunings. But which one is the best? Well, for normal people, average progression is good, but if you go at the rampage, you probably need tons of progression. But again, for normal people, too much is not good, because you always end up in the pillow example, soft and hard, which is actually harsh. We want a constant progression. So this was everything for today. Thanks for listening this real-time dubbing in English. Thanks for everyone. Please like my pages, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. I will do more stuff for you guys. If you have questions, ask, and ciao ciao.